de redes a la Agencia de Proyectos de Investigación Avanzada, ARPA, del Departamento de Defensa de Estados Unidos y otras compañías relacionadas con el Internet como Nominum, ¿lo dije bien? Espero que sí, donde es actualmente presidente de la Junta. Mockapetrics recibió el premio por la excelencia en telecomunicaciones John C. de Borac por el diseño e implementación de DNS, este es el invento al que me refería. El premio de la IEEE de Internet por su contribución al DNS y el premio por
contribution to DNS, and a distinguished University of the University of California. Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much for what I'm sure was a too kind introduction. Let me introduce myself a little bit. Paúl Mockapetrics. I'm currently a visiting scholar at the University of Pierre Marie Curie in Paris, so that I spend a lot of my time these days working with and I'm also chairman and chief scientist of a company called Nominum. We make and sell the what we believe to be the best DNS and DHCP software in the world. Open source is in second place. I'm sorry to tell everybody there. But we could have an interesting discussion about that. I think one of the interesting things to do is my last identity here is pvm@a21.com, and that's my personal identity. And one of the things I think is kind of interesting these days is that in the internet world, most people have multiple identities, and they have multiple ways of looking at problems. When I was first trained in school as a physicist, I was told that looking at a problem in the right way, or having what is called the right frame of reference, is often the biggest part of solving a problem. And today, when the internet is no longer network research, but is a public good and an industry and a forum and many other things, oftentimes the opportunities and the challenges lie in using these different perspectives to look at the same internet. So overall, I think there's two forces at work. There's the conventional wisdom, so to speak, of the internet. Being 25 years old, the internet has started to have its sort of old people, and they believe that the internet changes everything. You know, we just get rid of books, we just reinvent everything. But in reality, there's sort of a principle from physics that says that, for every action, there's an equal and an opposite reaction. Which means that when the internet disturbs society, society disturbs the internet right back. And when the internet changes the way businesses have to work, businesses go and change the internet back. And there's a continual interaction between these different ways of looking at the same thing that's key. So, that's why I adopted the title for this talk. And there's many people that will explain about how the internet just totally revolutionizes and throws out all previous knowledge. My thesis is that while it changes a lot of things, it is itself changed back. And it's important for us to understand oftentimes both sides of that back and forth relationship. Because if we just understand internet technology and not society, we can't necessarily make the right choices. If we assume that the internet is something run by academics and we don't understand the concerns of governments or the carriers, telcos, cable companies, etc., we can't necessarily understand what the right choices are. Why understand? Well, I just recently did a tour of the Galapagos, and very often in the natural world we all say the ideal would be to return it back to nature and have it all be green and no McDonald's and that sort of thing. We can't do that with the internet. There's no model of what the internet should be. We have to invent it. Now, there are some people that say, oh no, we have to go back to the good old days where everybody was an academic and nobody needed passwords because everybody trusted everyone. That's not going to work. We have to deal with some of the problems of society as well as the good things, and we have to envision what we want the internet to be and try and make that happen. There's lots of different parts of it. There's a completely separate part for everybody in this room, many more parts than that. There's a lot of issues to work on. So we have to create our own model. And very often the vested interests try to convince us one way or another that what we want to do is not possible or whatever. My favorite one was I invented the DNS. And several years after that, people came to me and they said, would it be all right if we had more top-level domains? And I said, of course. And they said, oh, because that was not the answer that they sought. It was very important for us not to add new top-level domains because of security and stability, and we really had to worry about that. Okay, these were the generic top-level domains. So then what happened? Well, we added 200, 300 different country codes, and nothing broke. So it was very odd, because the DNS doesn't know what a country code is. I mean, the fact that US happens to be a country code and .com is not doesn't matter. So this is kind of one of these examples where you have to make sure that you have some people that understand both the technical and the regulatory issues, or else these kinds of bad decisions get made. Evolution is another factor here. Here's kind of my diagram of it. In the early 70s, the internet was sort of a small corner of the world where network researchers lived. And perhaps if you thought about sort of the two axes here, one of which is the number of people and one of which is sort of the complexity or amount of different protocols and technology. The next thing that happened was the general educational world embraced the internet. Then the commercial world. And now it's the general public and perhaps their devices. People tell me, well, gee, how many phone numbers do you use up? And I usually tell them many less than the number of IP addresses I use up, although those sort of come and go. But the point is that if what you do is try and understand it from the world of the network researchers, you're only talking about a small corner of the whole world. And in any layer, you have to understand the others in order to make progress. For example, the user and the ISP have changed. In the 1970s, the user was a network researcher. And then, we got people in various educational institutions. Meanwhile, the people providing the network also changed, and also changed who paid for it. I remember we used to have big arguments about how the internet was free. The internet's never been free. It's just been a question of who's paid for it and how. And that's true today. One of the things I think is true is that also when you look at these evolutions, they arrive in different places at different times. So I left my internet connection in California that runs at 3 megabits in order to discover broadband when I went to France, and I have 75 megabits to my apartment. It's interesting because the internet is unevenly distributed around the world. Broadband probably isn't the only access to do this on. So if you have to fight against not having quite enough speed, in a lot of cases there's no substitute. But oftentimes hardship brings innovation. So I would urge you to just press forward and not be deterred if you don't have fiber yet. On the other hand, I'd really prefer that you get fiber. Evolution, as Darwin told us, can be either cruel or kind. The network researchers are pretty much ignored these days by the general public, but they did manage to have a bunch of stock offerings and get hired by companies and got big salary increases, so it was good to them. The R&D community, with the commercialization of the internet, has usually found it harder to get the government to pay for what they used to think, should be due to them. The average person has probably benefited in the sense that the cost of buying internet for the home has gone down and will continue to go down. But some of the costs of providing broadband internet to the home have to do with bulldozers, backhoes, and digging ditches and stringing fiber. There's a huge capital cost here. And that's something that we're just going to have to work through, both here and in my house in California, because I really want to get up to at least tens or hundreds of megabits. I'm going to talk a little bit about how different communities out there have different issues. First, I'm going to talk about service providers. Now, I'm not a service provider myself, but what Nominum does is we sell software to people like Telefonica and Verizon and British Telecom and Deutsche Telekom and so forth, the big companies, such that there's about 170 million users worldwide that get their domain names and access their web pages and email using our software. So we see the big numbers and the big trends and the concerns of the service providers. One of the big issues is the original idea of the internet was known as the network effect, or sometimes Metcalfe's law. And they said that the thing is that the usefulness of the internet, or the utility, was equal to the square of the number of nodes connected to the network. This sort of said that whenever I added a new node to the network, there was benefit to all of the already existing nodes. So each successive node that I added a disproportionate amount of utility. The problem is, in the real world, where not everybody is ethical, what's the added value of a hacker? Somebody that's trying to, capture your account information illegally, or, sell you yet another bogus degree or toy of one kind of another. It's probably the case that they dilute the value of the internet. So one of the issues that the service providers face is they find themselves in the middle of this environment where there's a bunch of customers over on one side and there's a bunch of internet resources on the other side. There's a lot of people who say, oh, network neutrality, they should just carry the bits from one place to another and not do anything about it. That's one point of view. But another point of view says, of those hundreds of millions of internet users out there, not everybody wants to become an internet expert. Not everybody wants to learn how to configure their firewall. Not everybody wants to have gigabits of pornography and, phishing attacks and all of this other malicious content delivered to them at high speed. Why shouldn't the service provider do something to separate that out? And these issues are only going to get more critical. The reason for that is, while my laptop happens to have a firewall and I've tried to configure it and so forth and so on, my iTouch doesn't have those rules. I have a network printer at home, and I used to just connect it directly to the internet, and it was very convenient because just before I went home from work, I might send some documents to be printed at my home printer and they'd be ready there, and I could read them when I got home. If I do that today, last time I measured this, every 5 minutes, somebody attacks that printer and crashes it. Now, of course, the fact that a hacker has managed to take over my printer doesn't give him much, it just crashes the printer. But the point is that there's a lot of danger out there. You cannot, for example, take a PC, connect it to the open internet, and install a copy of the Microsoft operating system and all the patches before that laptop or computer will be compromised. It takes longer to rebuild the operating system than it does for somebody on the outside to pull and attack your computer. So one of the questions we have is, should the carriers be responsible for doing some filtering? And if you go out there, I don't want to ruffle any feathers here in Latin America, but for example, if you go to the United Kingdom, the US, Australia, Japan, they're all having initiatives to say the service provider should clean up some of the content that's going by and filter out, depending upon where you are. Child pornography is typically always out there. Gambling sites may be out there, that kind of thing. What is the value that the service provider, the connectivity, should do to purify the content that you see? And needless to say, there's a huge problem over here because on my slide, Google is labeled as a good guy and the bad guys are labeled as bad guys, but it's not nearly so clear these days. How do we protect ourselves? Particularly, remember, it's the mass market. Not everybody wants to be a security expert. So it either has to be in the software in the laptop, which doesn't seem to have a particularly great security record these days, or perhaps in the carrier, or perhaps both. But it's a challenge we have going forward. And by the way, the challenge gets worse the faster the network is. We see network attacks on the DNS, and they occur much faster in Korea than they do in the US, simply because the average infrastructure is faster. The attack curves from a standpoint of infected machines look the same, except they're much peakier and much quicker when the network is quicker. How are we going to deal with that in the future? Let me talk a little bit about network researchers, of which I'm now one. One of the network research topics is the clean slate design. The basic idea here is that the internet has grown too ossified. You know, it's not flexible anymore. It's sort of got old age. And that what we should do is start completely over without taking into account the current network. Now, someone on the other side of this might say, well, what's really happening is that the network research community has no ability to influence the current commercial internet. People don't listen to them that much. And so therefore, that's where they're really going. I don't know which is the truth, but I think one of the questions is, how do we take advantage of the things that have really worked to go forward? Because I myself am not an advocate of clean slate. I believe that if you don't pay attention to what's happened in the past, you'll just get to repeat the same mistakes. And I always like to try and make new mistakes, and I think you should too. But one of the ways I think to do that is the network researchers often exist in their own world where there's just protocols and bits and bytes. So one of the things I think the distance learning community should do is to try and talk to those people a little bit, and they should try and talk to you as well. Tell them what it is you want in the way of technology. And that's, you know, one of the ways to move forward. Another big topic in the network research community these days is content-based networking, by which they mean wide dissemination of web content and other, you know, movies, video, etc. Now, I noticed that the network research community views this as a hot topic, but the people who designed YouTube are not really waiting for the network researchers to catch up. I think there's a real question about what are the new ideas and what are the ways to revolutionize this. And I think that's the biggest problem that I see in the, at least at the low levels of the distance learning. How do you get the content out there? We have an experiment that we're doing where people's mobile devices get loaded when they pass some other mobile device or fixed device that has the content. So there's a newspaper that's freely distributed in Paris, and when I go to work, I might have it downloaded from my Wi-Fi before I go, but if somebody else has their portable device in the same metro, subway car as myself, my device will share it with them, so that the mobile devices just carry it around, and whenever they come together, the content is distributed. In the past, this has been done with email servers mounted on the sides of buses in India that just go from village to village collecting and distributing email. So there's some of these modalities that we can use. This also ties in a little bit with delay tolerance, because subways aren't necessarily the fastest way to distribute content. Fiber is much faster than a subway. Users in society. You know, one of the things that I've recently, here in South America, there was one country that told one particular ISP, as a result of user complaints, you have to clean up your act before we'll let you take on any new customers. This is kind of a revolutionary kind of idea. And I can tell you that their ISPs around the world are nervous about this, because they say if this idea catches on, it's going to be bad. So one of the questions is, are users going to, through their political bodies, try and get the right level of services out of their ISPs, both in terms of quantity, this bandwidth, but also in terms of filtering out objectionable content? My personal view is that what the ISP should do is let me filter out whatever content I want. So that if I decide that I want to have content only suitable for 10-year-olds coming over my network, that's fine. You know, if people have other particular sensitivities, they should be able to do that. And it's a question about how to implement that. But I think the era of the user not stating their demands is over, and it's going to change the way telcos behave. Here's some other details about it. I mean, basically, it was a very strict thing where they just said, hey, you got to clean this up. If a user doesn't feel they've been getting the right service, they should be able to go away. All right. So, to conclude, the Internet's future is still ahead of it. There's a lot of people who believe that it's ossified and so forth. I say nonsense. On the other hand, particular technologies are going to go away. The technologies that, you know, are out there in the Internet, today's TCP is nowhere near the TCP that we had in 1983 when we started the Internet. The DNS has been improved. Although I wrote the original specs and so forth, many features, both good and bad, have been added over the years. One of the hallmarks of good work and good technology is that you can't anticipate all the ways it will be used, and people can build new technology on top of what's already there. One has to be careful about theory and practice. A bunch of the Internet technology works in practice, but when I was doing it, the people in Geneva and the OSI crowd were busy telling me, no, that can't work. So one of the things I would advise students to do, if they're looking for a research topic, try and find something that you believe in that the rest of the world has doubts, because that's where you can achieve a huge success. And lastly, the biggest opportunities and problems lie where these competing interests or disciplines intersect. And that's what I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention.